The vast, silent emptiness of space stretched endlessly before the massive alien ship. The advanced vessel was an incredible feat of engineering, sleek and imposing. Its occupants, the alien race known as the Zothrians, were explorers and conquerors, hardened by centuries of interstellar dominance. They were proud, technologically superior beings who had conquered many worlds. Yet, even they had never encountered a species quite like humanity. The Zothrians had arrived at Earth in search of knowledge, to study the remains of what they had assumed was a primitive, dying species. Earth had been abandoned centuries ago, its inhabitants scattered or destroyed in past conflicts. But one human remained, an anomaly, an old relic. The Zothrians had captured him effortlessly, or so they thought. General Marcus L. Hawk sat in the cold, metal-holding cell aboard their ship, his frail body hunched with age. His hair had long since turned gray, and his once imposing physique had dwindled into a thin, fragile form. To the Zothrians, he was nothing more than an ancient curiosity, an artifact from a bygone era. They regarded him with disdain, their superior intellect dismissing any notion of danger. In their eyes, the human was just a relic, a specimen of no consequence. His eyes, however, told a different story. Behind the clouded gaze of an elderly man was a mind that had once commanded fleets of ships, led troops into battle, and orchestrated some of the most successful military strategies in the history of the galaxy. But the Zothrians didn't know this. They saw only a frail human, weak and harmless, barely capable of lifting a weapon. They underestimated him, and that would soon become their greatest mistake. The aliens, still dismissive, monitored the general's every move. They found his calmness unsettling. Even in a foreign environment, surrounded by the unknown, the old human showed no sign of fear, no sign of resistance. He simply sat there, his hands folded in his lap, as though waiting for something. The Zothrians, amused at his indifference, made no effort to interrogate him. What would be the point? He was nothing but a broken soldier, a casualty of time. "What do we do with him?" one of the Zothrians asked, its voice a deep, resonant hum. "We keep him for study," another responded, its tone cold and clinical. "He is a remnant of a species that once waged war across the stars. His worth lies in what we can learn from him." A third Zothrian, an older one with a scarred face, added, "Perhaps we can glean something of their military strategies. It might be worth observing him further, but we should not waste too much time." The aliens' hubris clouded their judgment. They had no idea who they were dealing with. General Hawk had been a man who thrived in the chaos of war. He had led humanity to victory against enemies who had far more advanced technology, enemies who had underestimated the human resolve. They thought his age and frailty were signs of weakness. They could not have been more wrong. For the general, it was a game of patience. He knew that to act too quickly would alert his captors to his true nature. He had survived far worse situations, and though he now appeared weak, his mind was as sharp as ever. The years had not dulled his intellect. He had outwitted far more formidable enemies than these aliens. The Zothrians had no idea what they had captured. His thoughts drifted to his past. The years of endless battles, the wars he had fought in, the countless lives he had led into combat. His mind, though older, was still a battlefield of tactics and strategies. Every move, every word he spoke, every action he took was calculated. The Zothrians had made a critical mistake by underestimating him, and they would soon pay the price. As the days passed, the general observed his captors. They were methodical, efficient, and confident in their superiority. But he noticed their weaknesses. They didn't know it yet, but their arrogance would be their downfall. The general's eyes glinted with cold calculation. It wasn't just the technology that mattered. It was the mind. And human minds were unlike anything the Zothrians had encountered before. The aliens continued their experiments, probing into the general's past. They scoured his memories, trying to understand his role in the wars humanity had fought. But they missed something crucial. They failed to see the depths of his ruthlessness, the cold precision that made him a living nightmare on the battlefield. The general allowed them to dig deeper, feeding them just enough information to keep them entertained, but never the whole truth. The Zothrians believed they were unraveling his past, but what they didn't realize was that every piece of information they gathered was carefully manipulated by the general. He had been a strategist, a general who had taken down entire fleets and won battles through sheer cunning and adaptability. To the Zothrians, his tactics had seemed primitive. The idea of trickery, deception, and surprise was foreign to them. Their technology was too advanced, they thought, for such old-fashioned strategies to work. But what they didn't understand was that General Hawk had never relied solely on technology. He had relied on human ingenuity, on the ability to think outside the box, to adapt to any situation, and to outsmart his enemies. The aliens continued to study him, dismissing any signs of resistance as the result of his senility. But every day, the general grew more and more attuned to his surroundings. He listened carefully, observed closely, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The Zothrians had no idea that they were already dancing to his tune. His plan was simple: bide his time, study his captors, and exploit their arrogance. They believed they were in control, but in truth, they were already under his influence. He would make them regret underestimating humanity, and more importantly, he would make them regret ever thinking they could capture a man like him. In the quiet of the holding cell, the general's mind raced. He knew he would escape. He always did. It was just a matter of when. His eyes flickered as the Zothrians moved past his cell, their chatter filled with condescension. But to him, their voices were mere background noise. The real game had just begun. The Zothrians would soon learn what it meant to cross paths with a human general. And when they did, they would regret it. General Marcus L. Hawk's past wasn't one of quiet retirement. It wasn't one of peaceful solitude either. His history, though hidden beneath the surface of his frail exterior, was filled with violence, bloodshed, and cunning. As the Zothrians conducted their investigations, they were only skimming the surface, unable to understand the depths of the man they had captured. They had assumed they were studying an old soldier who had seen his better days, a man who had been swept away by time. What they didn't know was that the most dangerous aspect of Hawk wasn't his age, but his mind. The Zothrians were experts in technology. They had mastered weapons of mass destruction, impenetrable shields, and nearly untraceable stealth systems. Their tactics were advanced, calculating, and cold. They believed they had no equal in the galaxy. But they didn't know that General Hawk was a master of a different kind of warfare, one that transcended technology. It was the war of the mind, of strategy, of ruthlessness. In his prime, Hawk had faced off against enemies far more powerful and technologically advanced than the Zothrians. He had fought wars not with superior firepower, but with intellect, deception, and a relentless drive to win. The general had been the leader of humanity's most formidable military campaigns, orchestrating complex strategies that left his enemies reeling. He had not been afraid to sacrifice when necessary, and his reputation for ruthlessness was unmatched. His very name had been a symbol of fear, a reminder to alien forces that humanity could not be ignored or underestimated. His enemies had fallen not because of humanity's technology, but because they couldn't anticipate his moves. They couldn't read his mind. In the beginning, the Zothrians had been intrigued by the general's past. They believed they could learn something from his tactical genius, though they didn't fully understand its scope. Their first mistake was assuming that his strategies had been simple, outdated even. They thought of his campaigns as relics of an older time, the result of an era when war was fought with primitive methods. They could not grasp that his methods, though seemingly archaic, had worked because they were rooted in human ingenuity and adaptability. As they probed deeper into his memories, the Zothrians uncovered stories of battles, of worlds he had conquered and enemies he had outwitted. They found evidence of his mastery over battlefield psychology, of his ability to manipulate entire fleets without ever firing a single shot. They learned of his infamous Battle of New Vesta, where he had used the planet's natural terrain to create an unanticipated defensive strategy, one that caught the invading Zothrian fleet off guard. The Zothrians had lost hundreds of ships that day, their technologically superior forces crumbling under the weight of Hawk's tactics. What they hadn't understood then was that the general had used the environment as a weapon, exploiting their overconfidence and underestimation of human resourcefulness. They assumed that their technology would overcome any obstacle. Hawk proved them wrong. They uncovered the story of the Siege of Tython, where Hawk had executed a perfect feint, luring a much larger alien fleet into an ambush. His forces had been vastly outnumbered, yet they had emerged victorious. How? By turning the enemy's own strengths against them. The Zothrians, at the time, had been seen as the dominant species in the region, boasting the most advanced fleet. But their arrogance led to their downfall. Hawk had understood their psychology, their tendencies, and he used that knowledge to manipulate them. He had known they would be overconfident, that they would make mistakes. He had been right. The Zothrians, now obsessed with understanding him, failed to see the greater picture. They failed to recognize the core principle that had made Hawk so successful: his ability to anticipate and exploit the weaknesses of his enemies. To them, it seemed like luck, like sheer chance that he had won these battles. They couldn't grasp the concept of human resilience, the refusal to accept defeat, no matter the odds. They didn't realize that Hawk had never believed in the concept of impossible. He saw obstacles but never barriers. He believed in fighting, thinking, and adapting until there was no fight left to win. With every new memory the Zothrians unearthed, they became more obsessed, more intrigued. But the more they learned, the more they exposed themselves to Hawk's influence. He had already begun to manipulate them, planting ideas, manipulating the way they viewed him. They assumed they were in control, probing deeper into his psyche, but in reality, they were walking straight into his trap. Every piece of information they gathered was carefully curated. Every question they asked him was carefully answered, but never completely. He gave them just enough to keep them hooked, never revealing the full extent of his capabilities. The Zothrians began to notice inconsistencies in their findings. What they thought they understood about Hawk's past started to fall apart. The general had been part of a human force that had once fought an alien invasion, an invasion that the Zothrians had been a part of. The war had been brutal, lasting for years. The Zothrians, in their early efforts to dominate the galaxy, had encountered the human resistance led by General Hawk. They had underestimated the humans then, thinking their superior technology would easily crush them. But Hawk had turned the tide, using the humans' resourcefulness to outsmart and outfight the alien forces. The more the Zothrians uncovered, the more they realized their grave mistake. They began to understand the true nature of the man they had captured. He wasn't just a general. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a force of nature, and they had no idea how to stop him. The general, however, remained calm. He had anticipated this. He had known from the moment he was captured that the Zothrians would uncover his past. He had known they would try to dissect his history, try to understand the tactics he had used. And he had also known that once they did, they would regret it. They would see that humanity was not the weak, defenseless species they had assumed. No, humanity was a species that had survived because of its ability to adapt, to outthink, to endure. The Zothrians had learned the hard way that they had made a dangerous mistake by underestimating him. General Hawk smiled to himself as the Zothrians continued their futile investigation. They were only digging themselves deeper into the hole he had created. They were playing his game now, and they had no idea how it would end. The Zothrians had assumed that they controlled the situation, that they had the general exactly where they wanted him. But as their false sense of security grew, so did the general's sense of opportunity. For days they had monitored him, observed his every move, and analyzed his behavior, convinced that he was nothing more than an old man whose glory days were long behind him. What they didn't realize was that General Hawk had been using every moment to study them, to learn their weaknesses, their routines, and their overconfidence. From the beginning, the general had known that their technological superiority would be his biggest obstacle. The Zothrians had weapons, shields, and devices that far exceeded anything humanity had ever created. But the general had no intention of fighting them with brute force. His weapon was his mind, his ability to manipulate and deceive. Every moment they thought they were in control was another moment he used to set his trap. The first crack in their facade came when the general appeared to grow weak. The Zothrians, convinced that his age was catching up with him, decided to conduct a routine medical checkup. They watched closely as the human's vital signs were monitored, but what they didn't realize was that the general had already begun to manipulate their technology. The devices they used to scan him weren't fully calibrated for human physiology. As a result, the general fed them false data, making them believe he was in worse shape than he actually was. He exaggerated his symptoms, playing the role of a helpless, aging prisoner to perfection. The Zothrians, eager to help him, lowered their guard. They assumed he was simply a frail relic of a lost species, unable to defend himself. It was in these moments of complacency that the general's plan began to unfold. As the Zothrians moved away from their scanners, distracted by the readings they had gotten, the general made his move. He had spent days studying the ship's layout, memorizing the patterns of the guards and the locations of key systems. While they thought he was just sitting idly, he was actually making meticulous observations. He knew the alien ship inside and out. He understood its weaknesses, its blind spots. And more importantly, he understood the psyche of his captors. They had underestimated him, which was precisely what he needed. They believed they had him contained, but they didn't understand that he was never meant to escape through force. He would escape through their own mistakes. The moment the guards stepped out of his cell to report the results of his medical examination, the general acted. Using a makeshift tool fashioned from materials scavenged from his cell, he disabled the security lock on his door. It was a simple task, one that would have been impossible if the Zothrians had been more cautious. But their arrogance worked to his advantage. He slipped through the corridors, moving with the same cold precision he had used in countless operations during his prime. The old man had become invisible, a shadow moving through the ship's sterile, metallic hallways. The Zothrian security systems were state-of-the-art, but they had one fatal flaw: they relied too heavily on technology. General Hawk knew how to exploit human-made systems. The aliens, though far more advanced, had never anticipated that a human could outthink them in such an environment. He disabled cameras, short-circuited communication channels, and sabotaged any detection systems that could alert the ship's crew. With every step, he became more and more certain that his plan would succeed. He had no intention of taking down the entire ship. His goal was far simpler: create enough confusion to escape and then vanish into the vast expanse of space. The Zothrians, so sure of their superiority, had given him exactly the tools he needed. Their confidence had blinded them to their vulnerabilities. Now, as the general moved deeper into the ship, he knew it was only a matter of time before they would regret their mistakes. With each corridor he navigated, the general moved closer to the ship's central control room. He had studied the layout of the ship's schematics earlier, committing the locations of critical systems to memory. What he needed now wasn't just escape. It was to make sure the Zothrians would never underestimate humanity again. He had to make them understand that, no matter how advanced their technology, they could never truly control what they didn't understand. Reaching the control room was the hardest part. The Zothrians were hyper-aware of any unauthorized presence near their command center. But the general knew how to manipulate their perception. Using his knowledge of their routines, he timed his move perfectly. As a group of Zothrians left for a scheduled break, he slipped inside undetected, bypassing the last layer of security with ease. Inside, the ship's command center hummed with activity. The Zothrians were busy coordinating their next steps, unaware that a single human had infiltrated their most secure location. For a brief moment, the general paused, assessing the room. There were at least 5 Zothrians in the command center, all of them far more technologically advanced than him. But the general wasn't intimidated. He had faced down entire armies with fewer resources and against far more overwhelming odds. What mattered now was quick, precise action. He approached a nearby console, quickly accessing the ship's mainframe. The general's hands moved with practiced ease, tapping commands into the system as though he had done it 1,000 times before. Within minutes, the ship's main control systems were his to command. The Zothrian surveillance feeds blinked out, communications were scrambled, and the ship's security network went dark. The aliens, still unaware of the breach, continued to work as normal, believing their ship was secure. They had no idea they were already trapped by the very systems they had taken for granted. As the general initiated his escape, he set off one final signal, a subtle disruption in the Zothrians' command center that would make them panic. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a grand, destructive move. It was simply the beginning of their realization that they had been outplayed. They would soon understand that their advanced technology had never been the true strength of their empire. Their true mistake was thinking that a single human, even one long past his prime, could not outsmart them. The general moved quickly, slipping out of the control room and heading toward the hangar bay. The ship's crew, still scrambling to regain control of their systems, failed to notice his exit. The Zothrians were too caught up in their confusion to realize that their prisoner was already slipping through their grasp.